Hello. Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak about this very important but also very complex topic. So I try to break it down as much as possible so that everybody can follow. Even for me it was an extremely hard topic to get into. And I want to start also by acknowledging that this topic has been around for many decades and that there's people here in the room that have been at the forefront of the battle on GMOs, especially old GMOs, for many decades now. So shout out also to David here sitting today and many more. But with my presentation, I want to make a plea to the youth sector of the organic movement that this topic is very important and that we need to be active and vocal right now because currently there's a hot debate about genetic engineering again with the rise of new GMOs, so we need to be vigilant about this topic. Just a quick word about the structure of this presentation. I will start to explain a bit the context in which this discourse is now embedded and also explain what is genetic engineering, what are we talking about here. And then give a brief overview on the view of the organic sector on this topic. And lastly, I will talk a bit about the EU context, since this is really my expertise, and its importance in the global context and the global debate. So I think we can all agree that our food systems, as they are structured currently, are broken. We have intensive industrial practices which are dominating the food systems, with large dependencies on external inputs, fertilizers. We heard yesterday the alarming impact that pesticides can have on human health, presented by Andre Lieu. And there are many other issues, soil depletion, water pollution, and the list goes on. So clearly we need to find alternative pathways to strive towards a sustainability oriented agriculture. But what exactly that can look like is a hot debate. And there's different visions. And one of these visions, which is currently promoted, is the use of genetic engineering and specifically new GMOs. So here I just have one example of a report published by Bayer in 2022, where they explicitly say that Bayer, among many experts, believes that GM crops as a component of intensive agriculture contributes to sustainable and resilient food production. So this is a very typical statement made by the big industries, seed industry and agrochemical industries at the moment, hailing GMOs as the next silver bullet for sustainability. But what are we talking about when we talk about GMOs? So the abbreviation stands for genetically modified organisms, and that can be any animal, plant, organism, a molecular entity even, which has been produced by or derived from genetic engineering. And there's a variety of techniques which fall under that scope, including radiation, cell fusion, and also chemical induction, for example. And as I was saying, GMOs have been around for many decades, and so commonly we talk about old GMOs and new GMOs. So old GMOs are derived by techniques called random mutagenesis or transgenesis, which necessitates the insertion of foreign DNA into the organism. And globally we have a scattered cultivation. So there are some countries which have cultivated it quite widely, whereas in other regions it has not been cultivated yet or extensively. And importantly, these GMOs are also detectable, so you can do PCR testing and then you can see in the organism whether there has been a genetic modification or not. When we talk about new GMOs, we mostly talk about targeted mutagenesis, which means that you don't need any foreign DNA anymore. So you can make changes directly to the crop itself. So you can copy-paste cells, you can delete cells, and you can duplicate cells, whatever you want to do basically. And currently there's still very limited worldwide cultivation. There's a fish here and a wheat there, but we don't really have a lot of practical examples of this yet. But there's quite a wide acceptance among the, especially conventional agriculture, to want to take up this technology. And also importantly, there are no detection methods yet available. And I say yet because there's a lot of research going on at the moment to develop these detection methods. But this is the main argument from promoters of these new GMOs, to say that because you cannot distinguish them from conventional products, they should be treated as such. And so these new GMOs are derived by new genomic techniques, or NGTs. There's also many other names for this: new breeding techniques, novel genomic techniques, gene editing, but for the sake of this presentation, we'll talk about new GMOs and NGTs. And the focus is really on techniques in plural, because there are very many different techniques out there, the names of which you don't need to remember, but just for you to know that there's a plethora of techniques that are being developed and used. And a narrative which is often brought forward by promoters of NGTs is that it's extremely precise, that you can have a very clear modification, and you know exactly where this modification is, and you know exactly what you're doing. But having the precautionary principle at our core, we need to be vigilant about this, these claims about its preciseness and scrutinize them. So I wanted to dive a little bit into that as well. Because, in fact, there's research pointing at the unintended effects and risks that these technologies can have. So unintended effect meaning that even though you make an intended modification, it can have unintentional consequences, which can be either on the side of the modification itself or on the other side of the DNA, which is huge. So this is called on-target and off-target mutation effects. And these effects can also be immediately after the modification or delayed. They can be accumulated, or they can be interrelated to other factors. So there's really a variety of effects that we're talking about here. And one example that I wanted to give was from a hornless cow, which was bred in the US in 2015, I believe. And then it was claimed as completely safe. And then the US Food Safety Authority, they did a random check. They just took this example, and indeed they found that these cows had genes which can have antimicrobial resistance in them. So this was evidently unintended, and it's a huge issue, as Amra's presentation also showed yesterday. And beyond that, you can also have trade-off effects. So it's not like gene editing is this magical wish list in which you can tweak the traits as you want, and it has no unintended effects. So for example, there's a wheat which had a lower gluten content, but then in the end it had a quite limited growth and also reduced germination capacity. So with genetic engineering, there's no linear relationship between the extent of the modification. So for example, the number of modifications that you do, the number of insertions and deletions, and its risk profile. So that means that even small genotypic changes can have big phenotypic implications, and also not all sides of the DNA are equally protected. There's basically layers around some of the base pairs. So that means that not all mutations are equally likely to occur in nature. So gene editing has a high potency, which we don't see in nature. And so if anything, the potency of NGTs mandates really strong risk assessments. So for the organic movement, we are clear that we want to remain GMO-free, including GMOs derived from NGTs, so new GMOs. This has been on the international level reaffirmed back in 2017 after a very arduous and laborious consultation process internationally done with many, many organizations consulted. And Then also on the European level, we have unity on this topic. So back in July, for our General Assembly, we have passed a resolution reaffirming that the sector wants to remain GMO-free. And as I was explaining, this is rooted in the precautionary principle and the organic principles, for example, the principle of care. Also, organic is process-based and not product-based. So even if the crop itself, in theory, cannot be detected or separated from a conventional crop, if the technique has been used, it should remain out of the scope of organic production. And on a breeding level, this is because the integrity of the cell should be protected, so there should be no intervention below the cell level. And essentially for us, this is a broader debate about the freedom of choice for consumers and producers. So producers should have the right to use or not to use GMOs, and consumers should have the right to buy and not to buy GMOs. So this is a much broader debate that we're having here as well. And the organic movement, the rich experience of the organic sector has shown that for sustainability, we need to keep a systems-based approach to agriculture. So it's not individual traits which make the production sustainable. Here I have just a little excerpt of the newest legislative proposal from the EU. And in its annex, it lists a bunch of traits which are deemed then sustainable and on the basis of which certain GMO crops can get certain exemptions from the legislation. And so you can see that these traits are super broad. They include yield, they include also nutritional characteristics, for example. So this would relate to this gluten-free wheat that I was talking about earlier. But we need to be clear that resilience does not come from a specific crop or a variety, but rather from the health and robustness of the system as a whole. So one trait cannot be sustainable. Only the way that it's cultivated can take place sustainably. And for organic, we are always considering breeding as a goal to strive for improved symbiosis. So there's a lot of factors, including plant-to-plant interaction, as well as plant-to-fauna interactions and the microbes in the soil which are being considered. So a much more holistic view even of what breeding means. And what we've seen time and again, and also now in this debate, is false or misleading statements from the pro-GM lobby. And we need to also learn a bit from history. If we take a look back to the old generation of GMOs, we have seen that the same narratives that are being pushed now have been used 30 years ago, that GMOs would reduce the need for pesticides. But this has not taken place. This is de facto not happening. And here's a case, here's a case in Spain where there was a Bt toxin introduced in maize, meaning that no pesticide needed to be used there. But the corn borer, which is an insect against which this Bt toxin was supposed to be effective, developed resistance quite soon after the cultivation, and additionally it had negative impacts on the non-target species, so also, for example, small earthworms, which are really important for the soil health. And if we take a look at the new GMOs, few of the currently commercialized or pre-commercialized crops are actually addressing these big sustainability issues that we're having at the moment, like drought and climate volatility. And this has a reason. This is because it requires the modification of very complex traits. So for example, at least 60 genes are associated with drought tolerance, and these in turn are then mediated by other environmental factors. So it's not as straightforward as the industry is trying to sell it. And there's a study from 2021 which compared more than 230 studies, and only 5 of those were talking about these big sustainability issues. So there's a clear disconnect here between the narratives and the actual practice. I also brought to you an example from Dow DuPont Pioneer, that have developed a drought-resistant maize using a CRISPR-Cas technology. And in fact, in a study from 2017, the results showed that there was higher yield compared to wild plants, but only at the flowering time, so not at the grain filling time, which is actually the most important for the corn growth. So here again, we have a practical example, which is not really delivering on what it's supposed to. And in Europe, at least, we have really strong support from other organizations, from environmental NGOs, from consumer rights organizations, for this point that we need a systematic approach to agriculture and that we are dissatisfied with this trade-based, very narrow focus. So here's one letter, for example, signed by more than 300 organizations that we wrote to the Commission in the summer. So of course, innovation in plant breeding is necessary, and this is really the basis also of organic agriculture. We have to deal with the very complex challenge that we cannot use external inputs like pesticides. So we actually had to be incredibly innovative, but it should not be reduced to the use of these gene editing technologies. And there's simply no shortcut to circumvent the complexity of our food systems. Now I want to dive a little bit into what is happening globally. We have a very scattered regulatory landscape. So we need to be aware that when we're talking about GMO regulation, it's highly context specific and depends on where you live. So there are some countries and regions which have still quite strict regulation. There's most countries which are right now having an ongoing debate about overhauling the regulation, or that have already deregulated GM crops to some extent. And then also we need to be aware that globally the cultivation has been quite different. So there are some countries here that you can see that have had a big cultivation, whereas some countries and regions which have had none. So again, it's a very context-specific debate that we're having at the moment. So I write the EU as one of the last bastions. I actually had a conversation yesterday with Moon Jae-hang, who will talk afterwards, and he's from Korea, and he said that actually right now the Korean legislation is on pause because they're waiting to see what the EU is coming up with. So what we have in the EU at the moment for GMOs is a quite strict regulation. We have high standards for biosafety and for human health and consumer information. So our regulatory framework is based on 3 big pillars. First is risk assessment, so any crop which is going to be cultivated needs to undergo very thorough assessment on the negative or on the environmental and human health impact that it would have. We have a traceability system, meaning that on every single step of the supply chain, you will know whether a GMO has been introduced or not. And then we have a labeling system so that consumers see on the package that it's a GMO product or not. And this currently applies to all GMOs. But since this summer, we have a new legislative proposal, so this is being discussed now, on the so-called new genomic techniques to adapt the current framework that we're having. And what they basically did is to introduce 2 new categories. And I'm not going to go into detail of this table, but the point here is that for these 2 categories, the 3 pillars, so risk assessment, traceability, and labeling, have been either watered down or removed completely. One thing that I do want to mention is that we had engaged in extensive lobbying work towards the EU Commission ahead of the proposal. So we actually managed to get it into the legislative proposal text that both of these categories are still prohibited in organic farming, which was not evident at all. So this was a really important thing for us to achieve, because now we have a basis to actually discuss how we can make this work. But there are many open questions and concerns that we are having. Again, I'm not going to dive into detail, but there's questions about how coexistence, if any, can be guaranteed with the organic sector. How will we deal with contamination and liability? I talked about sustainability and this annex, which had listed these sustainable traits. I mean, this is a huge potential for greenwashing, consumer labeling, and the precautionary principle, and much more concerns that we're having as well. So right now we are at a historical crossroad moment, especially for the EU legislation, as I was just explaining. And Matthew, actually yesterday in your introductory statement you said, and I quote you very loosely, "We are the stewards of this planet and there is no planet B. We must persevere in advocating for organic principles and our visions." And the GMO debate is one of those examples where the topic and the timing right now really mandate our insistence on the organic principles and on our vision. And so I really want to plead to you on this topic to advocate for the organic principles and our right, our freedom of choice to remain GMO-free, and to show that alternative pathways which look at sustainability in a holistic way are needed rather than a narrow focus on the next technological fix. Thank you very much, and I'm open for questions afterwards.